Good evening. If I could have your attention. We open this evening with a moment of prayer. The lives of a whole people, stretching back thousands of years, moments of peace of finite number. The Shoah and the Tree of Life more emblematic. For that same time, her prophets and rabbis have assured them that they have a special place at the table, but privately may have wondered what other communities and their religious leaders believe and teach. Once again, anti-Semitism has crept back into so many corners. Once again, it must be rooted out and swept away. The time is now to sit and really hear the history, assess the current situation, and say what we believe and teach. We pray as a multi-faith community that we all know that we are all children of God, that we all know that hate is not the fruit of the tree of life, but a poison spread by humankind, that we all know that peace is the way forward. To that end, we will sit together and listen and talk and model reason over violence. Blessed be. Amen. Shalom. Good evening. I'm the Reverend Dr. Thomas Bodie. I'm a member of the Akron Area Interfaith Council and chair of its Spiritual Life Committee. Let me first begin by thanking Reverend Nanette Pitt, Bobby Burt, and the rest of First Congregational Church for so graciously hosting us this evening. Then let me welcome you all here in the church sanctuary and those of you who are watching from home to the first of a three-part series on anti-Semitism. Evening one tonight, and I'm told, I don't know if I'm now we're going to say it twice together. The fourth anniversary? Fourth anniversary of the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. Evening one is indeed entitled, we've seen this before, The Historical Path of Anti-Semitism, with Dr. Christopher Seeman, professor of theology at Walsh University. Evening two is November 3rd, Thursday evening, November 3rd, from 7 to 8:30, entitled Rising Numbers, Anti-Semitism in America Today, with Jim Pash, the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Evening three will be November 17th from 7 to 8:30, Strength in Numbers, What Our Interfaith Community Can Do. That will be a panel discussion of local religious leaders on what all of Religious Akron and further can do to make our neighbors feel safer. The story of this series begins with the hostage-taking at Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Colleyville, Texas, in January of this year. Thankfully, all the hostages survived. But once again, a very violent action directed against innocent Jews raised the ugly specter of anti-Semitism in America. As if, because it ended with, I was going to say, it seemed as if afterwards there was just silence, right? As if because no one was killed or injured, it didn't really happen, or it didn't really matter somehow. And the question of how to understand that silence was indeed raised up here in Akron, as it must have been all over the country from synagogue to synagogue. It was not front page news. It was pushed to section B, page 11 by day 3. One wondered from synagogue how much security would have to be enough security. The question of how to understand that silence, as I say, was raised up here in Akron. I know for us in AAIC, in a meeting with Rabbi Josh Brown from Temple Israel, and Rabbi Brown offered the beginning of a dialogue in the religious community, inviting members of AAIC to Temple Israel. We attended a presentation by Jen Chestnut of Hillel on the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. That presentation offered more than just a recitation of facts, dates, events, policies. It seemed more like trying to explain how one might hear, how the heart might feel the pain attached to those dates and figures and events. The same old hate right in front of our faces. And one could wonder if even we in the religious community, more leaders of the community, invested with the right of using the prophetic voice, had become numb or complacent or something far short of prophetic. And we apologize, of course, for that sense of complacency, and we would like to push back against that complacency. We would like to be part of a conversation, an ongoing one, about making our Jewish neighbors feel safer in their own home, in their own community, in their own places of worship. That's what the organizers of this series hope to help along, that dialogue. And we thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope that you will stay with us through the rest of the series. We hope that you will help us think of ways to continue that conversation in order that Akron is known as a place that stands up to hate and discrimination. And I'd like to get right down to it. So let me introduce this evening's speaker. This evening we are joined by Dr. Chris Seeman, a professor of theology and chair of humanities at Walsh University in North Canton. He chairs the Catholic Biblical Association's task force on addressing representations of Jews and Judaism in Catholic exegesis, homiletics, and catechesis, a project supported by a grant from the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine. Professor Seeman is a passionate promoter of interfaith dialogue and has been involved in numerous initiatives to eradicate anti-Semitism and Islamophobia from North America. His scholarship focuses on early Judaism and Christianity. Join me, please, in welcoming Professor Seeman.
Thank you. Is this working now? It is. Can you hear me? All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I have not had much contact with the activities of the Interfaith Council of Akron. I'm just down the road in North Canton, but I'm very gracious to be invited to participate in this. It's something I think about on a daily basis, both in my scholarship and in my teaching. And more and more, I am concerned with how do we get the facts to people in a form that people can understand. I mean, scholars talk scholarship, but we want to figure out how to put this on the streets. But I've been asked to talk about the background to this, right? How is what's going on today similar to what's happened in the past? And so I'm going to try to provide my own way of thinking about anti-Semitism, if you want to use that term. Anti-Judaism is another term that's been used. My own Jewish colleague says I should just say Jew hatred. But whatever term we use, we need to understand how it works. Because if we don't understand the nature of a thing, then we cannot truly find a way to overcome it. So I'm going to offer a brief kind of historical sketch about where all this comes from. And some of you may be surprised at what I'm going to suggest, but that's fine. You're welcome to challenge, question, object as much as you want. I'm not going to be presenting controversial ideas. These are ideas that have been long recognized. But still, it's something that challenges us and should challenge us. So my goal is to challenge us tonight. I will also offer some thoughts. I'm going to pretty much back off after I've given my spiel, and that way we can really focus on what you want to talk about in your questions and your comments, because I think that's where we'll be most fruitful. Okay, so let's begin here. So first of all, I would have to ask, what is anti-Semitism? Is it a matter of feelings, right? Hatred is a feeling. It can lead to actions. Is anti-Semitism hatred? Well, you could probably find many acts of anti-Semitism that involve hatred, that involve feeling, but there are plenty of anti-Semitic acts and ideas that are enacted by people who proclaim that they have lots of Jewish friends. So it can't just be feelings. Is it then the ideas? Are there these ideas, these stereotypes, these images of Jews that are how we define anti-Semitism, whether people have a certain feeling about it or not? Well, there's a certain amount of truth in that as well, because of course anti-Semitism, it can be documented, it can be defined in terms of ideas, but they're not disconnected ideas. They're not random ideas. They do change over time. So what people thought about Jews a century ago, at least in the mainstream America, is probably not the way we think about Jews now. There are different stereotypes that have emerged. Why does anti-Semitism change its colors constantly? What I want to suggest tonight is that anti-Semitism is not just feelings, it's not just ideas, it's a narrative. It's a story that involves both feelings and ideas. To help us think about this, I was attracted to an article that came out not too long ago, 2 years ago, by the Christian ethicist Reggie Williams in the Christian Century. He was commenting on the murder of several African Americans by police officers, which of course is something that is still with us, unfortunately. But the way he was addressing this topic from a Christian perspective was interesting to me. As he was analyzing the phenomenon of racism, I found something similar to his analysis of that and what I'm going to talk about with anti-Semitism. So I'm going to read this to you here. He says, "To be white is by default to be the protagonist. Somehow the black dead deserved to die. They were destined for this kind of death. That is the plight of the antagonist." So a protagonist and an antagonist, they are defined by a narrative, what he calls the racial script. To be the protagonist also means to be given the benefit of sympathy, even when caught in the act of murder. This is an evil loop that happens so often that each instance quickly commingles with the next evil loop in the pattern. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Perhaps this is something of what you were talking about when there was no reaction to the non-massacre of Jews in Texas. That's all in the script, he says. The plot line may not always end with the white killer being acquitted, but that is not the point. What matters is the reality-bending rationality of race that makes it logical to blame the dead for their own killing. So I'm not going to suggest that anti-Semitism follows exactly the same script as for other forms of racism in our society, but I'm attached to this idea of script. So he talks about antagonists and protagonists. So anti-Semitism defines Jews as antagonists of someone. So what is the script of anti-Semitism? If Jews are the antagonist, who is the protagonist? We need to know the story that this is a part of. What is the script's rationale, and where does it come from? These are the questions I want us to think about tonight. So this is the third president of my institution, Walsh University, Brother Francis Blue, and he wrote an article way back in 1995 called The Christian Roots of Anti-Semitism. This is a Christian religious right here. He says, Christianity did not create the Holocaust. However, the Holocaust was not conceivable nor possible without the 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism that preceded it. Hitler and his lackeys often quoted Christian authors and enacted legislation based on church canon law. These are facts. The question is, how do we interpret them? He suggests that if we want to understand anti-Semitism, we have to understand Christianity. He is not saying that Christianity is anti-Semitic. He is suggesting, though, that if we want to understand anti-Semitism, we need to understand what are the building blocks of it, and how has Christianity, or shall we say an interpretation of Christianity, supplied those building blocks to be built into that edifice of hatred. So I'm going to give a little history here. I'm not giving a whole history of anti-Semitism, but because I study the ancient world and early Judaism and Christianity, this is what I know something about. So there are three historical factors that have contributed to the rise and persistence of anti-Semitism. The first is the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 CE. The second is friendship, fellowship between Jews and Christians in the Roman world, interestingly. And the third is the Christianizing of the Roman Empire itself, turning it into a state religion. I'm going to look at each of these briefly, and then we're going to talk about the building blocks. But we need to know something about this history. So, why was the destruction of Jerusalem relevant to the birth of anti-Semitism? Now, before the year 70, many non-Jews had fairly terrible stereotypes of some Jews, but it was never systematized. It never became widespread. As a result of this catastrophe that happened in the year 70, the new regime, which came to power in Rome at this time, there had been a civil war in Rome during this period, and the winners of the civil war, they declared that they had saved the Roman world. And they used their victory over the Jews as a kind of reference point for their victories. Have everyone seen the Colosseum in Rome? What was that built with? That was built with the spoils of this. So when there are all these, suddenly making the Jews villains became important for imperial propaganda, right? And it encouraged, the regime encouraged, or at least didn't stop, others within the empire from adopting these views. So various stereotypes, which may have been harmless in and of themselves, were systematized. And this became one of the spurs to the development of anti-Semitism. How did this become involved with Christianity? Well, Christianity began as a Jewish movement, right? By the 2nd century AD, most followers of Jesus were non-Jews. A demographic change took place. Most of these followers of Jesus knew nothing about Judaism. Many of these followers of Jesus were influenced by this narrative that the Roman emperors had put together, or at least were encouraging, and unfortunately they read it into their own scriptures. But it was not full swing. It was not that all Christians suddenly joined on the bandwagon of imperial propaganda. We know that all the way at least into the 4th century AD, we know that Jews and Christians often were friendly with one another. They even participated in one another's religious practices, such as fasts and feasts. We know this because there were various church leaders who were upset at this. This is a famous homily given by John Chrysostom. He was the Bishop of Constantinople in the 4th century. And when he heard that Christians were fraternizing with their Jewish brothers and sisters, he says, "What is this disease? The festivals of the miserable and pitiful Jews are soon to march upon us. There are many in our Christian ranks who say that the Jews think as we do. Yet some of these are going to watch the festivals of the Jews, and others will join the Jews in keeping their feasts and observing their fasts. I wish to drive this perverse custom from the church right now." He speaks about this as the Judaizing disease. So for various reasons, various Christian leaders attempted to create a sense of separation between Jews and Christians. Rabbis were not immune from this as well, but the fact is that this was encouraged by leaders. Then we get to part 3, the Christianizing of the Roman Empire. So the Emperor Theodosius, as he transformed or completed the transformation of the Roman Empire into a legal entity based on Christianity, he wrote, "It is our desire that the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue to profess that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine apostle Peter, as it has been preserved by faithful tradition. We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians, but as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics. They will suffer in the first place the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second place the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven we shall decide to inflict." Now this is not unique to Christianity. We can see this in human history whenever a particular religion or religious community becomes dominant and is entangled with political power, no comparison with today, you will see these sorts of things take place. But this was a factor contributing to it. So these are the 3 factors early on that encouraged the development of an anti-Jewish rhetoric within Christianity. But that itself doesn't explain where it all comes from. These are just encouraging, aggravating factors. There were many consequences of this. I don't need to go through all of these, but from the 4th century onwards. This is my favorite one. So when do Christians celebrate Easter? Well, originally, at least for a large portion of the empire, Christians celebrated Easter depending on when the Jews were celebrating Passover, because when did Jesus die? Somewhere in connection with Passover. When Constantine became emperor, though, he was asked to weigh in on this matter. He said, "We should certainly not follow the same calendar as the Jews because we are different from them." And so what was at least a time of the year where Jews and Christians had an overlapping narrative for their own different reasons, now was officially separated because we can't be like them. Right? And there were many other things that took place. Some of them were ideological like that. Others were legal, prohibiting construction of synagogues, forcing Jews to convert or be expelled from their homes, confiscating Jewish educational funds for the imperial treasury, Jewish-Christian marriage punishable by death. If you convert to Judaism, then you lose your property. All sorts of legal disabilities. Again, not unique within human history, but you can see with all these things happening how it would fuel and solidify anti-Jewish rhetoric. Okay, so with that as our background, what are the building blocks? Where does this all come from? So I'm going to be referring to various scholars who have weighed in on this. The one that I always turn to, because I find her way of describing it to be very simple and effective and useful, is a Christian scholar named Katrina von Kellenbach, whose dissertation looked at the role of anti-Judaism in feminist religious writings. The second wave of feminism in advocating equality for women, dignity for women, and so forth, often appealed uncritically to stereotypes about Judaism to show how Jesus was a lot better than that. Right? In her analysis of these writings, and I think it goes beyond this particular issue to defining anti-Semitism in general, she says there's 3 building blocks: antithesis, scapegoat, and prologue. I'm going to explain each of these as we go. So first of all, antithesis. What does that mean? Von Kellenbach writes, "Antithesis identifies Judaism with the negative side of dualistic oppositions, such as justice and love, judgment and promise, or law and grace. While the definitions of Christianity change, Judaism is always correlated as its opposite. By rendering Judaism its negative antithesis, Christian theology asserts its difference and superiority over the rival faith." Did you know that the very word Judaism, as it came to be developed and used in first the Greek, then the Latin language, it was a Christian construct? Now, there are actually early Jewish writings that use this term Judaismos to refer to an active choice to observe God's commandments for Israel. St. Paul uses this language. Second Maccabees uses it. These is all from the Hellenistic and earlier Roman periods. But in the 3rd century AD, again, as Christianity is starting to build a kind of imperial identity for itself, it redefines Judaism not as observance of God's commandments, but rather as a whole system of thought. So the very word Judaism has been turned by Christianity in this early period to mean the antithesis of Christianity. Right? Think of Jesus' greatest hits, right? The Sermon on the Mount. There's a place in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." Do you know what people have traditionally called that? The antitheses, even though that's not what they are. But they say Jesus is different from Judaism. Jesus is representing Judaism, and then he says, but I'm saying something opposite. Even though he doesn't say something opposite, that's how it's read. So this whole idea of what some people have called an oppositional imagination, as long as Christianity uses Judaism as its antithesis, a building block of anti-Semitism is present. This particular element of anti-Semitism has been explored at length by the New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine, who writes, through a chic apologetic that seeks to make Jesus politically relevant to the 21st century, Christians find in Jesus the answer to whatever ails the body politic, whether it is war, ethnocentrism, an institutional religion intertwined with the state, or misogyny. In order for Jesus to serve this liberationist role, he has to have something concrete to oppose. The bad system then becomes, in scholarship and in the pulpit, first-century Judaism. So, if you've ever been in a church before and heard a homily, you may have heard one of these things before. This is the top 10 list that Levine puts together. God's commandments for Israel were burdensome, and Jesus taught his followers to ignore them. Jews follow God's commandments in order to earn salvation, but Jesus offered an alternative of grace. God's commandments about purity were bad. Jesus violated them and told others to ignore them as well. Jewish society demeaned and oppressed women. Jesus liberated them from these constraints. Jewish law deprived married women of all rights. Jesus prohibited divorce to protect women. Judaism marginalizes and excludes others. Jesus embraced them. Jews were expecting a militant Messiah. They turned against Jesus because he wasn't a militant Messiah. Jews lacked a personal relationship with God. Jesus revealed a God who wants intimacy with human beings. The temple in Jerusalem was a corrupt institution that oppressed people, and Jesus denounced it. Jews loved only members of their own group. Jesus' openness to non-Jews was unprecedented. Now, all of those positive statements about Jesus are mostly true. What's untrue is that this is what opposes him to Judaism. A knowledge of Judaism shows that these are not true antitheses. These are fabrications. These are inventions. One of my students actually said this. I have a class where I try to have students read Jewish text to understand what Jewish values actually are. And I said, so let's talk about the idea of love of neighbor. And this student's conclusion, without any discussion of the text we read, was, well, the main difference between Jews and Christians is that Jews put themselves first, but Jesus put others before himself, and that's why we Christians do that too. News to me. I mean, he conjured it out of nowhere. And it's not that he's a bad person, he's a beautiful person. But he's been ingrained with this way of thinking, perhaps at the pulpit. Perhaps this is what he heard from the pulpit sometime. This happens in my church, something like this happens in my church once every 2 or 3 weeks. Not because they're anti-Semites, but because they've been brought up to think oppositionally about Jesus and Judaism. Okay, so that's one type of building block of anti-Semitism. Judaism becomes the opposite of Christianity. The second building block is scapegoating. Jews as scapegoats. Christian theology casts Israel in the role of scapegoat and characterizes Jews as guilty, evil, and predisposed to deicide, killing God. This is the classical Christian charge against Jews. Israel is blamed for evil in the world. Sound familiar? As a punishment for her various crimes culminating in Christ's murder, Israel is rejected by God, who elects the Gentile church instead as the legitimate heir of Israel's covenant with God. The portrayal of Jews as morally depraved, politically sinister, and religiously ominous legitimates Christianity's replacement of Israel. Now, this, of course, is coming out of a religious context. But if you think about some of the expressions of anti-Semitism today, which might have no direct connection with Christianity, do you see a similar pattern? This is where it comes from, right? It's a building block that can be weaponized by various different groups. An example of this. Here's the example. 4 years ago to the day, I'm told that was not intentional, but it just happens to be October 27th, 4 years ago, right? The Tree of Life massacre. Now, we remember the famous thing that Robert Gregory Bowers said about going in and killing these people who are killing my people. But then we discovered soon after the killings took place what his internet handle was, right? On his social media, he said, "Jews are the children of Satan. The Lord Jesus Christ has come in the flesh." Where did he get that? Jews as scapegoats, Jews as God killers. Where did he get that? He got it from the gospel. This is a famous conversation in John's gospel where Jesus speaks with the Jews. If anyone knows anything about the gospels, John's gospel is different from the others. John's gospel homogenizes all opponents of Jesus into a title, the Jews. So here's their conversation. The Jews say, "Abraham is our father." Jesus answers, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works of Abraham, but now you are trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth I heard from God. Abraham didn't do this. You are doing the works of your father." The Jews say, "We're not illegitimate. We have one father, God." Jesus answers, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and am here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It's because you can't hear my word. You belong to your father, the devil." That's what Robert Gregory Bowers is paraphrasing there. "And you willingly carry out your father's desires, and he was a murderer from the beginning." So this is where this is a building block. I'm not saying this is anti-Semitism. That's a whole other issue. How do you interpret this? But can you see how easy it would be to say, okay, well, it's not that the Jews are just politically sinister and evil, but they are this way by nature. Their father is the devil, not God. Now, if you read John's gospel and the other literature in the New Testament attributed to this community, you'll discover that the idea that their way of talking about identity is really a performative sense of identity. When we behave in a certain way, we are children of God, and when we don't, then we're not. But that's a pretty, you need to spend a lot of time reading to notice that. If this is all you read, you can see how it could easily be weaponized. So that's scapegoating. The last building block, Israel as prologue. This rule of formation, writes von Kellenbach, accounts for Christianity's continuity with Israel's past by reducing Judaism to the status of a prologue of Christianity. Judaism is identified with the Old Testament and is seen as a relic of ancient times rather than as a contemporary and vital religious alternative. As a result, Judaism can legitimately be incorporated into Christian prehistory. Now notice there's nothing violent about this. In fact, of these three building blocks, this is the one that is probably pretty essential to most brands of Christianity in some form. Right? Christians believe that they are linked to Israel's story. But once you say that Judaism is merely a prologue, well, maybe its place in the world, maybe the Jews' place in the world has now been superseded by someone else, by a protagonist, namely Christians. And once you make that leap, which is stated nowhere in the New Testament, then you can say, well, if the Jews have no other function in history, because we've absorbed all of their positive functions that they may have once had, do they belong at all amongst the living? Think again to Reggie Smith's discussion of the racial script. You are able to blame the dead for their own deaths. So when Jews die or when things happen and Jews are blamed, Christians might say, well, that's terrible, that's too bad, but they had their chance and now it's gone. This is called supersessionism. It's called replacement theology. It's something that most mainline branches of Christianity have denounced in some form, but it was also mainstream Christian theology for most of the last 2,000 years. But still, if this is something that Christians need to affirm in some way, shape, or form, how do you not allow it to be weaponized for other purposes? Here is, from my own Catholic tradition, the language that is used. And I'm going to use this simply to illustrate, first of all, how this idea is affirmed, but also how it could be misunderstood. So this is from the Catholic Church's Constitution on what the Church is. Right? This is from Vatican II. It speaks, I'll summarize here, it speaks of God choosing people not as individuals, but as a community. He saves people not as individuals, but as a community. He brings them together because that's what salvation means. It means being a community. It means belonging. So it says God chose the race of Israel as a people, right? But this choice of Israel, says the Church, this was done by way of preparation, as prologue, right? As a figure of the new and perfect covenant which was to be ratified in Christ, and of that fuller revelation which was to be given through the Word of God himself made flesh. And so, the church, the Christian community, is identified as the new people of God. Now, this is pretty solidly based in the earliest Christian scriptures, so it's not something that can be jettisoned. The question is, by claiming that some group is a new people of God, does that mean they have replaced the old people of God? Or not? Notice that the text does not say this. It just says there's a new people of God. It doesn't say whether it is superseded. There are other church documents that says, no, we have not superseded. Israel, the calling of God is eternal and cannot be revoked. Israel is not cursed by God in any way. But, that's theologians who talk that way. What about people in the pews or on the streets who hear something like this and they say, oh, so we're now the people of God and the Jews aren't? You see how this can be weaponized. Okay, so we've now looked at 3 building blocks of anti-Semitism. They are not perhaps by themselves anti-Semitism, but if they are brought together and lived out, practiced in the ways we've seen in history, then we get what we get. I return to Reggie Williams' article in the Christian Century on the racial script. He says, white people remain trapped within a history they do not understand, one from which they need release. But they must act. They must be committed. To act in response to this history, however, is terrifying. It requires engaging a complete recalibration of one's own identity. Short of that, there is no exit. He's actually quoting James Baldwin there. So let's change white to Christian, right? In today's Christian nationalism, the two are the same thing, but let's assume, what about Christians remain trapped in a history they don't yet understand in order to prevent themselves from allowing these building blocks to be weaponized? They need to rethink who they are. Not get rid of who they are, but rethink what they are. Rethink how their words and their teachings and their scriptures are used and abused. So that leads into the question of what do we do about this now that we've described what I see as the problem. How are we to escape this script that is so deeply ingrained from these 2,000 years that we've had to work on it? I'm not going to suggest that it is impossible to escape or rewrite the script, but we need to think carefully about how our words and how our actions, even with the best of intentions, I'm not talking about, Kanye West and that kind of crowd who are, overtly, engaging, delighting in this kind of, weaponized rhetoric. I'm talking about the rest of us who say we're not that. And yet, every Sunday, when people hear a sermon being preached, is it training us to think about Jews and Judaism as the antithesis of us? Is it training us to think of, well, maybe they're to blame for something? Is it training us to think of them only as a prologue to us? Are there ways we can think about Jews and Judaism differently? That's the question I'm going to open up for discussion. And I'm actually open to any questions or any topics you want to discuss. So how do we transition now from this to that? We have questions here?
We do have questions here. And I want to hand this over to Mr. Tom.
Thank you.
Who has his mic? Do you still have your mic? You left your mic. No, I didn't.
Okay, we'll do that. Okay. Each Palm Sunday, it is common to have the Passion story read or enacted. Can you comment on how this story and its theology reinforces anti-Semitism by naming those who gave up Jesus to keep their own safety, i.e. the Jews?
Thank you. Yeah, you can hold on to that. Yeah, well, obviously, when we think of those building blocks, the scapegoat part is very important to the way in which the Passion narratives have historically been read. We have to remember, of course, that there's 4 of them, right? And they're not all the same. Now, they all have similar elements, and without getting too sophisticated, I think you can see a trajectory. Why are they not all the same in terms of the concept of responsibility or blame? In at least my tradition, we recognize that the Gospels, although they speak, that they faithfully transmit Jesus' sayings and deeds and what he did and all that, they are also written, configured to speak to a particular audience at a particular time. So when John's Gospel lumps all of Jesus' opponents together as the Jews, this is not reflecting historical reality. All you need to do is look at the other Gospels. Jesus never combats with the Jews. But John's Gospel represents a time and a place. We're not sure what the time or the place was, but we know it is different from the other times and places where the others are written, in which there is a deliberate sort of othering of the Jews as an enemy. So and many of these narratives are read, right, in lectionary readings every Easter. One of the ways in which they have been attempted, how the Christianity has attempted to avoid them from becoming anti-Semitic tirades is by having the people in the parish read the part of the people, right? So it's very clear that this is us that are doing this, not some other group, right? And we would say, well, this is the people who disavow Jesus. They represent all peoples. They don't represent the Jews specifically, right? This is a way of dealing with that. It's not entirely useful in the end because it still ends up with the people saying, well, but we've been redeemed, right? Maybe we failed like Peter, but we've been redeemed, whereas those other people, they didn't, right? It's a problem. However, I think there's a glimmer of hope here, too. The earliest Passion narrative, which we find in the Gospel of Mark, I would argue lacks any attempt to blame a particular group. Why do the crowds reject Jesus? In John, it's because they hate him, but this is not historical reality. Look at the others. The crowd in the Gospels, this is the one group that consistently supports Jesus from start to finish. Even more than the disciples, they support Jesus. So why do the narratives suddenly have them turning against Jesus at that story? Jesus himself I would argue, gives a lens for understanding this. It's called the parable of the sower. Anyone remember this parable where the sower sows seeds in 4 different types of soil, and depending on the soil, the environment, the seed will either be fruitful or not? The trial of Jesus is a parable of the sower. There are 3 possible reasons why people don't end up sticking with Jesus, right? There's because Satan takes away the word. That means you're already hostile towards him. The crowd certainly doesn't fit that. They've been his supporters all the time. The cares of the world intervened, and you don't respond as you should. That means you are desirous of wealth or power or something else. Well, the crowds aren't looking to get a buck out of this or get more power out of this. There's only one option, is that they're afraid. They're afraid that if they say, yes, this is the King of the Jews, release him, what will Pilate do to them? Well, who's standing next to Pilate there that will later, beat Jesus up? It's his cohort. What does Pilate do? He massacres Jews at the slightest opportunity to show that he's in control. So the crowd, in the earliest Passion narrative, disavows Jesus because they don't want to die, just like Jesus' disciples. Remember Peter? What motivates him to deny Jesus? He doesn't want to die. James and John, they say, we want to be with you, O Lord. He says, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? In other words, can you die with me? They say, sure we can. They aren't there with him. This is part of a narrative of fear. It's not a characterization of Jews. It's a characterization of what happens when people are threatened with violence. So it's possible to read the narratives in a way that doesn't identify the crowds with the Jews. Yes, they are Jews, but they are his supporters. We should really be thinking of these as Jesus' supporters. Why do Jesus' supporters, why do his followers not always stand with him? Do Christians always stand with Jesus? The martyrs do, but not everyone's a martyr, right? So this is not a narrative about Jews versus followers of Jesus. It's about how people fail out of fear. It's not distinctive to Jews at all. Later on, in the later Gospels and the rewrites of this narrative, it becomes that. And there may be historical reasons that this is representing antagonism between the early church and whatever local Jewish community is down the street, but that's not reality. So that's one way of thinking about it. We need to, first of all, recognize that not all the Passion narratives are the same. But what happens when we do read them? That's a good question. We need to actually, one of the fact, what we call fact sheets. One of the things my task force does is we create fact sheets for various controversial or sensitive topics with the preaching of the gospel, and one of them is how we understand the death of Jesus. There's a whole fact sheet suggesting ways of how to talk about that and not to talk about that in a liturgical setting. There's actually a lot of good, at least within the Catholic tradition, there's a lot of good guidelines on this, which are often not followed. But yeah, this is a challenging piece. How do we can't say it's not there. You can't ignore those passages because they're kind of crucial for the story. So that's one thought, is we recognize that there's more than one way to think about it.
We have another question, and we're actually going to change things up a little bit. I said that Tom was going to be reading all of the questions. Tom's not going to be reading all of the questions because sometimes we have handwriting that can be a little difficult. So I would still like for you to write your question or to put your question in the chat. I will come to you so that you can voice your own question. That way we know that we are reading it or that it is being read correctly. Please signify by letting me know, and I will bring the mic to you, and we'll kind of go from there. I have a question over there. I also have a question that's here, and I have a question in my hand. So it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order, and we'll get to you in just a moment. The question that I had that was already written, pardon me while I put the glasses back on, is to combat anti-Semitism, it is first necessary to define it. Are you aware of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? And subpart of that is that many world prominent Jews, in alignment with that definition, the IHRA definition, call anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism. Can you comment?
So I am not familiar with that definition up here for the moment, but I take it, I understand the point that's being made is, how, because the way in which it expresses itself changes over time. Almost no one today is going to say Jews are evil because they killed Jesus. I mean, that's the classical trope, and it's been denounced, pretty thoroughly. I mean, only fringe groups say that, and unfortunately, some fringe groups are being mainstream. But people would argue that there are other stereotypes that this idea of antithesis or scapegoating is transferred to. So, is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? It can be. It can be. How exactly does it do that? Well, it is based on, partly, some of those antitheses we looked at earlier. The Jews, unlike Christians, unlike civilized people, the Jews are ethnocentric. They only care about their own, and so they commit injustice against others. That is a trope that's often tied in with anti-Zionist rhetoric. What makes it anti-Semitic is that it is stated that this is by definition, this is essentially what Zionism is. Not that it's not saying that Zionist projects can go awry and lead to terrible things. Any project can go awry. The point is that it makes it as essential to Zionism. If one studies the history of Zionism and studies the precursors to the emergence of the State of Israel, one will find that there are Jews all over the spectrum on this. When the Stern game murdered non-Jews in what was then the Mandate, rabbis stood out against them and they condemned it, right? But they still believed that Jews should have a homeland. So I think that what makes it anti-Semitic is, first of all, it suggests that Jews can have a homeland, just not in their historical homeland, right? Even though everyone else can. It holds them to a different kind of standard, and it's one that is specifically designated to denigrate them as not being a real people, not being a people with a historical connection to a place. There are plenty of Zionists who are critical of Zionism, right? So simply to be critical of Zionism or critical of Zionist policies is not anti-Semitic, but what makes it anti-Semitic is saying that it is essentially barbaric, uncivilized, ethnocentric. Once you get into that rhetoric, then you get into something that approximates anti-Semitism. So yeah, I would argue it does and it can. The forms of anti-Semitism that I'm focused on are more of the ones that come out of what we might say not the right or the left, but the center, right? These are the tropes we see in sermons all the time. These are the kind of soft forms of anti-Semitism that aren't even recognized as such, which encourage us to think in these ways in general terms about Jews and Judaism. Yes?
Stand up. I've enjoyed listening to you very much. It's very enlightening and fascinating to hear about. I'm wondering, how do Jewish scholars and theologians weigh in on this matter? Would they present the same kind of history and explanations and descriptions?
Most of what I told you is taken from Jewish scholars. I mean, von Kellenbach is a Christian scholar, but Levine, she's a prominent New Testament scholar who is an Orthodox Jew. There are more Jewish scholars involved in the study of this period now than there have been in the past. And so a lot of the sensitivity to the way in which even ancient Judaism is represented in scholarship is much more forward and upfront, and we come to recognize that even scholars tend to reproduce these stereotypes, partly because, and we're talking mainly about biblical scholars often are not trained to know anything about Judaism. They read the Bible, but that's not Judaism. Judaism is the Bible plus Jewish tradition, but they have no knowledge of Jewish tradition, and that's why it's easy then to mistake some of the tropes and the stereotypes that one finds in early literature as being representative of Jews. But yeah, no, I would say that there are major Jewish scholars. Amy Jill Levine is one. Mark Brettler is another. The Jewish Annotated New Testament is a great compilation of Jewish scholars of ancient Judaism who comment on early Christian texts from a Jewish perspective. you can, I mean, there's quite a few scholars, they're not all Jewish, who deal with this early period of the development of Christianity, what's called the parting of the ways, right? How does Christianity become its own thing and not just a sect of Judaism? It's a complicated process, and Jewish and Christian scholars have all sorts of different theories about it, but they all agree that it's a process that can be studied and understood, not just as a historical set of events, but as something that we can use to understand, later history and perhaps even aspects of our own present. Is that sufficient?
Yes, I'm glad to hear that. I'm not familiar specifically with Katie Levine. I assume that she might be representative of.
She's on our task force. Yeah.
But the other scholars you talked about were not.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just hoping that there is agreement where some of these backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
these are general things that are not too controversial that I'm presenting. Again, there'll be people who would take slightly different views on it, but I'm largely basing this on Jewish scholarship as well as Christian scholarship. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I see that hand there. Sir, I have two questions that are ahead of you. Is your question related to that question?
It's related to that question and a follow-up to the question of mine that you read.
Let me get this gentleman first. I will be with you because they seem to all tie in together. So if I can get...
My question is this. Do you think that people are basically hardwired to hate anybody that doesn't look or act the way we do?
So do I think people are hardwired to hate people who are different from them? So people in general. Is this sort of a human evolutionary biology sort of point? Or are we raised culturally to do this? I mean, I would leave that to the sociobiologists to figure out whether human nature itself tends to create an in-group and an out-group. But, of course, this is true throughout human history. There's always an in-group and an out-group. There's family and non-family, and we get this in the Bible itself, right? There's you, there's your family, there's your neighbor, and there's your non-neighbor, and you're supposed to love them all as yourself, right? So that's a core value in Scripture, and it is in Judaism and Christianity. Jews and Christians have essentially the same view on that. Do they always do that? Of course not. Right? People fail. We call that sin. But is there something about identity which intrinsically makes people want to hate or fear an other? I'm not convinced of that. I think that often when we talk about culture, how identity is constructed at the social level, often identity is constructed in oppositional terms, as I've been talking about, kind of this oppositional view of Jews by Christians. It's not necessary, though. There's nothing that requires that we behave that way. So I would say I don't think it's intrinsic, but it's certainly possible. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? That was my question about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism.
Could you share that definition with everybody?
Excuse me?
Could you share that definition with everybody?
Yeah. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And in 2016, they formalized a definition that they had been working on for many years. It's interesting that it takes a lot of people a lot of time to come up with a definition of anti-Semitism. And even then, it's been very controversial. It's not been accepted by universally, although the United States and about 36 countries of the world have adopted this definition. And germane to it, a key point of it is that it ascribes denial of the Jewish people to their homeland in Israel as essential to anti-Semitism. In other words, Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, is essential to Judaism, and anti-Zionism thus is anti-Semitism. And I would recommend to everybody here, they can get a very clear, easy to understand crash course in this subject in 6 minutes from an animated video that was made by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, recently deceased Chief Rabbi of England,
Yes.
one of the leading theologians of the Jewish world in recent times, and he put it together, a 6-minute video, the relationship between Judaism and Israel,
Yeah.
and defines anti-Zionism as the new anti-Semitism. And this, for a group that is asking the question, what is anti-Semitism and what are we going to do about it in the modern world, as you yourself said, it's not so much did the Jews kill Jesus. That's not the, it's still there, but there is a new form of anti-Semitism that is growing and sweeping the world, and this is what it is.
Okay, thank you for sharing that definition with everyone, so we know what we're talking about here. Yeah, I would say a couple things to that. First of all, it probably took Jews a long time to come to that definition, because when the state of Israel was founded, there were many and still are many anti-Zionist Jews, the ultra-Orthodox camp, right, who believe that the state of Israel can only be created by God, not by humans. Most Jews, however, since the time of the founding of the state of Israel, have come to a more nuanced position. Like, yeah, it's important that we have a homeland. It's an essential part of Judaism. The form it takes, that's up for debate, right? But there has to be a homeland. But there are anti-Zionist Jews living in Israel, right, who think that Israel should be ruled by non-Jews, right, because it's not the kingdom of God, right? So yeah, you can have fringe groups, right, who hold the different viewpoints on that. But to pick up on your point there again of, is anti-Zionism in this sense that Jews alone cannot have a homeland, is this another form of the deicide charge? The classical, Jews killed Jesus, Jews killed God thing. Let's think about that. What is the function of that charge? It is to put a particular group of people so far beyond the pale of humanity, right, that they are literally inhuman because they have murdered the source of their own being, right? That's essentially the logic of the charge that the Jews are God killers. And the result of that is that charge tends to go along with this idea that people who are willing to murder God are certainly going to have no moral compass, and they'll be purely obsessed with power and themselves and so forth. You can see that in a lot of anti-Zionist stereotypes, I think. So in a sense, that's really the scapegoating idea, right? That's the element of the scapegoat that is now foisted upon the state of Israel. The Catholic Church, by the way, has, I think, pretty much agreed with that definition. There are some statements within the Catholic tradition that say, yes, Israel has a legitimate right to live in the land of Israel, right? So there is, at least within Catholicism, a recognition of that to some degree. Where does this come from for Christians? It comes from Acts chapter 1. When Jesus is about to go up on the divine elevator, what do his disciples ask him? Are you, at this time, going to restore sovereignty to Israel? Does anyone remember what he says in response? See, you got to know your scriptures. This is a pretty important question. It's the last question they ask him before he goes up. The answer is, it's not for you to know the time set by the Father. Instead, your job is to go and proclaim and make disciples of all nations. He doesn't say no. And what was Jesus' message? What is Jesus' message? Well, it includes love your neighbor because he's Jewish and he's teaching the Torah, right? But that's not his message. I mean, he does teach that.
Follow God.
Follow God, yeah, but the Jews don't need to know, they don't need someone to tell them that. They already know that. His message is, the kingdom of God is at hand. It's drawn near. So repent and believe in the good news that the kingdom of God is at hand. He says to his disciples, this will all happen in our generation. I don't know exactly when, only God knows, but it will happen. When the angel Gabriel in Luke's gospel announces Jesus' future birth to his mother, he says, he will rule on the throne of David. Where is the throne of David? Jerusalem. So there is, now, Christians may try to read this allegorically. It doesn't really mean that, but there is arguably a component within certainly Jesus' teaching that, unsurprisingly, he too believes that there is a land. There is a land. There's going to be part of the world to come, but it's still a land, right? St. Paul says all Israel will be saved because God said they would, right? All Israel will come into its own. He doesn't know how that's going to happen. He's very perplexed by the fact that not all Jews agree with him, but he says, I know that all Israel will be saved. They will all be brought into the kingdom because that's what God promised, and God keeps his promises. And if God didn't keep his promises, why should we follow God? That's nothing new. I mean, Moses argues with God all about this. When God says, I want to destroy Israel, Moses says, no, you can't. Because if you did, you wouldn't be God anymore. And God agrees with him. So there's a whole strand within not just the Hebrew Bible, but also the New Testament that takes for granted this connection between people and land. Now, exactly how would that work out in history? That's a question of history. That's a question of how people who want to realize that restored community of Israel within its land, what would that look like? That's a question of history, politics, ethics, all those messy things, right? Will it look the way that the ruling party wants it to look? Maybe not. Is the way in which people try to implement that always just? No, it's not. That's because people are human, right? And human institutions are often embedded in unjust practices. But to say that Israel is uniquely that, and therefore essentially cannot be allowed to exist, that's anti-Semitism. So I guess I would agree with that definition.
We have an online question.
It really isn't. It was mine.
Oh, sorry. It's Kathy's question.
I wondered if you could comment on the ability of the Christian community to reach out to other groups. I feel, since I've been working in this area for a while, there's so many walls, and I keep, is me? What did we do wrong? Da 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 da. But it just seems like the walls are, maybe they're coming down some, but we used to call this kind of dialogue ecumenical. I don't hardly ever hear it called interfaith, although it's getting better, and then multi-faith. We're getting to multi-faith. And is that part of the anti-Semitism? Is it just part of the fear of the other? And also just mixing it up more. It just seems so difficult. And can you speak of that as a Catholic theologian?
Sure, and but before I do that, could you give an example of one of these other groups, just so I can work with an example here? I mean, so yeah, we have
Islam.
With Islam, okay, yeah, sure. Well, this is something that I learned. So the question again is what are the walls to genuine fellowship and dialogue and so forth? What are the barriers to this? Not just between Jews and Christians, but with Christians and other groups. Before I came to Ohio, I lived in Iowa, and I lived just down the street from the Mother Mosque of America, which was the oldest physical structure that Muslims had planted in the U.S. It was in, I think, the 1920s or 30s. Syrian refugees built it there. It's this little Midwestern house with a minaret in a residential neighborhood. So we, and this is interesting. I'll tie in with the Israel question here, because the university I was at was invited by the Friends of Sabeel, which is a Palestinian advocacy group, to host a peace conference on Palestine-Israel at our university, and my Jewish colleagues there said, don't do this. There's going to be some anti-Semitic remarks. And at the time, I had no experience of this. I said, well, no, we ought to allow it. It's, marketplace of ideas. And there were, in addition to some nice constructive presentations, there was also some really bad anti-Semitic stereotypes being launched. And once it happened, no one wanted to take responsibility for it. And our university almost lost its connection with the local Jewish community as a result of that. So the rabbi and I and the imam got together and we said, we need to somehow reverse this. So that led to my first interfaith experience, was responding to an immediate problem, responding to a crisis that no one wanted to take responsibility for. Together we formed an interfaith coalition called the Children of Abraham. So it was a three-way dialogue between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And it was largely educational because we discovered that the community in Cedar Rapids didn't know much about these different faith traditions, the ones that were not themselves. And we got along really well. We made a lot of progress in education. Then as soon as we started talking about the state of Israel, the walls came up. And we were unable to dialogue because there was too much mistrust among some members of this group. What I learned from that is that there may always be walls or barriers, not just between faith communities, but between individuals within communities. And you can't know what those will be in advance. You just have to encounter them, and then you have to figure out, well, how are you going to not write that person off or write that group off? How are you going to embrace and bring them into conversation with you? Often it means not talking at all. Often it means just being with them. I remember speaking with a Muslim woman who was also engaged in interfaith dialogue. I said, so what do you all talk about in your meetings? She said, well, we don't talk about theology or religion. We just invite each other over to dinner at each other's house. And her point was this, that the fundamental barrier to any kind of dialogue is trust. And trust is built on relationship. If you have no relationship with another group, you have to create the relationship. And at some point then, maybe you'll get to talking about ideas. In the Catholic tradition, since you asked me to respond to it from that way, the Asian bishops, who represent, a minority religion in most of Asia, they say there's three types of dialogue. There's talking dialogue, which is what we normally think of as dialogue, the dialogue of ideas, right? What do Jews think? What do Christians think? What do Muslims think? What do Buddhists think? And there's something to that. But they also said there's also a dialogue of life in which we befriend people, right, from different faith traditions, and we come to know them as individuals. We come to know them as friends. And sometimes that will lead into a dialogue of spirituality. How do we live out our faith? When I brought this model to North Canton, Rabbi John Spitzer, who was then just retired from Temple Israel down there, he and I put together a series of interfaith gatherings. They were dinners that we would have. We would shift from the mosque to the temple to various churches in the area, and we would have dialogue on how we live out our faith. Because that's something that you don't need to be a theologian to do. We had a wonderful dialogue on prayer. And we learned how each other prayed. And we had sort of, knowledgeable speakers speaking. And I think one of them was actually the imam from the center up here came down and talked to us. But one question from the audience was, well, is there anything we say in common in our prayers? And the theologians were kind of scratching their heads like, we don't know. And this one woman, who was a Muslim woman, convert from Christianity, said, we all say amen. And then the walls kind of fell down at that point. It's like, wow, I didn't realize that. We have something in common that's this deep, And so out of these kinds of experiences, that's my tactic. How do you create interfaith conversation? You have dinner with people, or you invite them to your parish or your church or your congregation, and you talk about something everyone can talk about, like prayer or fasting or whatever it might be, and then we learn who they are as human beings, who we are as human beings too. We did one on fasting at my parish, and one of my students who was there says, now I know that Muslims fast for exactly the same reasons that we Christians fast. And now when I see them fasting at their time of year, I will be in solidarity with them because I know I support that they're doing the same thing that I strive to do when it is Lent, So it's these sort of on-the-ground connections, I think, which are far more effective for building relationship than simply saying, let's have an interesting theological conversation about what we believe. That's important too. but it's often not the way you start things. So that was my response. Is that a good start? Okay, that's a good start. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to ask you to hold on just a minute till we get a mic to you.
I'm sorry. Go for it. Yeah, because the people online won't hear otherwise.
I apologize to the people online. Father Greg Boyle, who is a Jesuit, has made the statement a number of times that that everyone is unalterably good, with no exceptions. And his response to, well, then why do people do bad things, is he always asks himself what in their background damaged them to the point that they did whatever. But he says that there are no exceptions. And so when you address people like that, it's what you're talking about, relationship, and he calls it kinship. Could that be useful in some of the actions that we want to take to combat anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. So, in other words, if Kanye West or someone else, some public figure, is saying terrible things, yeah, obviously we need to rebuke, because that's part of what love means according to the love your neighbor passage in Leviticus. Rebuke your neighbor when they are saying something wrong, because otherwise you're complicit in it. So there's certainly rebuke, but yeah, one must understand why and where and how that person cannot think of the world differently. At least at that moment, they cannot bring themselves to think of people or themselves differently. Yeah, I think that's absolutely important. And of course, we have to apply that to ourselves too, right? And that would include things like, why are we ready to write people off who are saying terrible things? Oh, it's because they're bad people and we're not, So we do obviously have to go to the question of why. But of course, that won't happen until we tone the conversation down from the rhetoric that you see in the news and all that. That there may be a place for rebuke, but there has to be a listening as well and an understanding. And that's why you can't really get to those people until you have established trust with them, which takes a long time sometimes.
We are getting to our last couple of minutes here. I have actually a quick question for you from one of our listeners who did not get the full what IHRA is. If you could go over that, as well as where to find the 6-minute video. And while I'm doing that, if you have a question, please raise your hand.
IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, or Alliance, I believe. International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the video is at Rabbi Sacks, RABBISACKS, one word, rabbisacks.org, and look under videos.
Thank you.
Greatly appreciate it. And I saw someone else right there. We have a question. We have a pew right there also.
I always am happy that that people hear about and want to develop relationships with people who are not like them, and the things that we can do as individuals. And at the same time, it seems to me that if you look at anti-Semitism across the 2,000 years, that often, similarly to racism, people in power evoke anti-Semitism as a way to keep their power, just like they evoke anti-Black rhetoric to keep themselves in power. So I love the idea and would love to see more of it, that we develop relationships among ourselves in Akron. But to what degree do you think that it's the people keeping themselves in power that brings this up anti-Semitism, racism, brings it up over and over and over again. And is there any way to really change that?
So the question is it that we're recognizing a difference between ordinary people and people who are weaponizing this in order as a power play? I think we can expect that to happen because that's what people in power do to keep their power, among other things. It's a separate problem, but I think that if we begin, we can only begin with ourselves, not just individually, but collectively. People of, communities of faith, if they know their neighbor truly, they will not listen to the rhetoric. Probably the best way one essential strategy for dealing with the problem of politicians or whoever, we're talking about leaders, doing this is by modeling a kind of community that will not listen to it. Because ultimately, if people aren't going to listen to the rhetoric, people will stop using it because they will find that it is not useful for keeping them in power. Unfortunately, nationally, we're in a state where this is, we're not there because there are a lot of people listening to that, terrifyingly a lot. But we need, and that's all the more a reason why we need to be focusing on the ground where we are and the people that we come into contact with or we reach out to or who reach out to us. That's not the only solution, but it can't happen without it. I mean, it's sort of like responding to climate change or something like that. Recycling is not going to solve the problem, but if no one recycles, then the problem won't be solved, right? So you have to address it at many different levels. Anything else?
We're getting to the end of the night, so right now we want to take and have that promotional time for what is on tap for next week. I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Tom.
Okay, so again, Thursday, November 3rd, 7 to 8:30. This will be hosted at Temple Israel in Fairlawn, right? And that will be Rising Numbers, Anti-Semitism in America Today with Jim Pash, the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League, exploring the factors that might help us to understand the striking rise in hate crimes directed at Jews right now and in our country today. The address for Temple Israel, 91 Springside Drive, Akron. And then to Connie. Oh, Connie.
I can just imagine what's going through your minds and hearts after this brilliant presentation, where I know I learned a lot. I have a lot to think about, and I'll just bet that some of you do as well. And I thank you so much that we concluded some of the remarks on the very thing that I wanted to mention to you. And I see a lot of our current members here, and I see some friends and some folks that maybe this is the first AAIC gathering that you've come to. So we welcome you. I wanted to read and maybe just shut your eyes and think about what the mission of AAIC is, especially in relationship to what Dr. Seeman just said. This is the statement. The mission of AAIC shall be to coordinate and enable effective interfaith responses to the social, moral, ethical, and cultural issues of the Akron community, and to promote freedom of religion, equality, and understanding, unquote. Now, in addition to that, though, we have a vision. We're visionaries, by the way. And you know some of the folks here really are. But this is our vision of AAIC. For centuries, there are times when religion has been misused to cause wars, hate, and division worldwide. AAIC is a witness to the power of love and compassion for all humankind, which really is the basis of every faith tradition. By acting locally to practice and promote religious understanding, AAIC goes beyond mere tolerance. We hope to make the world a better, safer place for everyone and for all of God's creations. And I'm continuing the vision. We create a community that is bound together in harmony and love, that through interfaith peace and goodwill make the Akron experience awesome. And finally, that faith matters. Interfaith connects. Our unity builds a community that cares, serves, and loves. Everyone is someone. So please know that everyone in this room and those that are in the space virtually is issued a very personal invitation this evening. And Dr. Seeman set the stage for my comments perfectly. There are many active people here who are the workforce for AAIC, and you know who the worker bees are in this room. And they're also the inspiration. But we really need additional people to help us do the very thing that we're talking about tonight. And so as you came in, we had a sign-in sheet. If your name's there, I'll be in touch with you. There's a form that has our application if you'd like to join AAIC. And we have committees. Oh, yeah. And if you want to sign up for a committee, or 2 or 3, we would love you to do so. And they are the Social Justice and Peace Committee, the annual Hunger Walk, which, as you know, is very successful in Akron, the Spiritual Life Committee, the Education Committee, or the Public Relations. And I just want to show you because it's just an outstanding piece that you will get if you become a member. And this is by our Risa Matthews, who is helping us this evening. And she has designed this fabulous communication tool. And we collaborate in Akron. We're not trying to put on all the shows. We want to advertise your programs, the other things that are going on as well. And that's what Risa has done for us. It catches your eye. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank you so much, Dr. Seeman. You're the man. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you at the next program.